The rain poured down in heavy sheets, drumming against the pavement and washing over the quiet streets. It was one of those nights when the sky itself seemed to cry, and the cold wind howled through the city, sending shivers down the spines of anyone caught outside. Amid the storm, a woman stood huddled at the entrance of a grand, towering mansion, her arms wrapped tightly around two small children. Their clothes were soaked through, their bodies trembling, and their faces pale from the biting cold. She was a widow. Her name was Lisa. Life had not been kind to her. Just a year ago, she had a home, a husband, and the quiet joys of a simple, happy family. But fate had other plans. Her husband's sudden passing had left her not only heartbroken, but also drowning in debt. Bills piled up, and one by one, they lost everything: their home, their security, their stability. Now she wandered the streets with her two little ones, Sarah and Noah, hoping for nothing more than a dry place to rest for the night. The grand house in front of them was not just any mansion. It belonged to a man named Richard Donovan, a self-made millionaire who was known for his wealth, his power, and his cold heart. He had built his empire from the ground up, turning a small business into a fortune. But along the way, he had lost something far more valuable: compassion. To him, success meant power, and power meant never showing weakness. Lisa didn't know who lived in the house. She didn't care. All she wanted was a small corner by the massive doorway, a place where she and her children could escape the rain for just a little while. She wasn't asking for food, for money, or for kindness, just shelter from the storm. She pulled her children closer, whispering softly, "Just a little longer, my loves. The rain will stop soon." Inside the mansion, Richard sat comfortably in his luxurious living room, a glass of expensive wine in his hand. He barely noticed the storm outside. His world was warm, filled with the soft glow of chandeliers and the scent of fresh-cut roses in crystal vases. But as he glanced towards the front gates through his massive windows, he spotted them, three figures, drenched and shivering, huddled by his door like unwanted shadows against the golden lights of his home. His eyes narrowed. He despised seeing beggars, especially near his property. To him, people who had nothing were simply those who hadn't worked hard enough. He had built everything he had from scratch. He believed that if he could do it, so could anyone else. There was no excuse for weakness. With a sigh of frustration, he picked up his phone and called security. "Get them off my property," he ordered coldly. "I don't want them near my house." Outside, Lisa didn't see the guards coming until it was too late. The heavy footsteps on the wet pavement made her heart sink. She turned to see two men in dark suits walking toward her, their expressions unreadable. "Ma'am, you need to leave," one of them said firmly. Lisa's eyes widened. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "We're not here to cause trouble. We just needed some shelter for a little while. The children, they're so cold." The guards hesitated for a second. Perhaps they saw the desperation in her eyes, the way she clutched her children, shielding them as if her body alone could keep them safe. But orders were orders. "I'm sorry," the other guard said, though his tone carried little sympathy. "You can't stay here." Lisa felt a lump rise in her throat. She had been turned away from places before: stores, shelters, even strangers who had looked at her with pity but offered nothing. But this was just cruel. She wasn't even asking to go inside. Just a few feet of dry ground under the overhanging roof. Was that too much to ask? Tears mixed with the raindrops on her face as she looked down at her children, their tiny fingers gripping her coat, their faces buried in her arms. She could see their exhaustion, their hunger, their quiet suffering, and it broke her. But before she could plead again, the guards stepped forward. "Ma'am, you have to leave." Now, she had no choice. With a heavy heart, she tightened her grip on Sarah and Noah and took a step back. Then another. The guard stood firm, watching as she slowly turned away, stepping back into the freezing rain. The wind howled around them, and the night stretched endlessly before her. As Lisa and her children disappeared into the darkness, Richard Donovan took another sip of his wine, never once glancing back at the people he had just cast out. But what he didn't know was that life has a way of coming full circle. And soon he would learn that the people we turn away today may be the very ones we meet tomorrow. The storm raged on as Lisa walked through the empty streets, her arms wrapped tightly around Sarah and Noah. Their small bodies shivered against her, and she could feel their exhaustion with every weak step they took. The night was cruel, and the cold bit into her skin, but what hurt the most was the heaviness in her heart. She had begged for nothing more than a dry place to rest, yet they had been turned away as if they were nothing. She looked down at her children, Sarah, only 7, her face buried in Lisa's coat, her tiny fingers clutching tightly. Noah, barely 5, walked beside her, his little legs struggling to keep up. Their shoes were soaked, their lips trembling. Lisa wanted to tell them it would be okay, but how could she promise something she wasn't sure of? She kept walking, hoping to find shelter somewhere, anywhere. An old bus stop, a small corner under a building, a doorway that wouldn't chase them away. But the streets were empty, and every step felt heavier. Meanwhile, inside the grand mansion, Richard Donovan carried on with his night as if nothing had happened. He sat by the fireplace, flipping through business reports, sipping his wine, completely detached from the world outside his walls. His mind was occupied with numbers, deals, and profits, the things that had built his empire. He had no room for distractions, especially not people who had nothing to offer. But in the silence of his home, something gnawed at him, a strange, uncomfortable feeling. He wasn't a man who believed in guilt, but for some reason, he found himself thinking about the woman and her children. He had seen their faces for only a moment, but it had been enough. The desperation in her eyes, the way she had clutched her children, the way they had disappeared into the darkness. He shook the thought away. It wasn't his problem. The next morning, Lisa woke up to the soft light of dawn, finding herself curled up on the steps of an old library. She had held her children close through the night, keeping them as warm as she could. Sarah and Noah were still asleep, their faces peaceful despite the harshness of their reality. Lisa ran a gentle hand over their hair, her heart aching. She had to find food, something to keep them going. With slow, careful movements, she stood up and walked toward a nearby bakery. The warm scent of bread filled the air, making her stomach twist with hunger. She hesitated, then took a deep breath and stepped inside. "Excuse me," she said softly to the man behind the counter. "I don't have money, but I have 2 small children who haven't eaten. If there's anything you could spare." Before she could finish, the bakery owner, a kind-looking older man, nodded. "Wait here." Moments later, he returned with a small bag filled with warm bread. Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. The man smiled. "Take care of those little ones." With the food in hand, Lisa hurried back to Sarah and Noah. They woke to the smell of fresh bread, their eyes lighting up as Lisa handed them each a piece. For the first time in days, she saw them smile, and for a brief moment, the weight on her shoulders felt a little lighter. But Lisa knew this kindness wouldn't last forever. They needed something more, a real solution, a real home. Back at the Donovan estate, Richard's day had started like any other. Meetings, calls, investments, everything running smoothly. But as he glanced through the morning news, something caught his eye. A story about a woman and her 2 children who had been seen wandering the streets in the storm, a widow who had lost everything. Richard frowned, feeling an odd sensation in his chest. He knew it was them, the ones he had cast away. He quickly folded the paper, shaking the thought away once again. He had no time for distractions. But fate had other plans. Later that evening, as Richard left a high-profile business dinner, he stepped outside to find himself face to face with a familiar pair of eyes. Lisa. She hadn't noticed him yet. She was across the street, holding Noah's hand, while Sarah sat on the sidewalk beside her. Lisa was speaking to another woman, someone handing her a few coins, nodding in sympathy. Richard stared, something twisting deep inside him. He had assumed she would disappear into the city, swallowed by the streets. But there she was, still fighting, still holding on to her children, still trying. He was about to look away when something happened that he didn't expect. Noah, the small boy who had shivered outside his mansion the night before, suddenly turned his head and met Richard's gaze. Lisa turned sharply, her eyes widening as she saw him. She recognized him instantly, the man who had ordered them away, the man who had watched from behind his warm windows while they stood in the rain. Richard didn't know what to say. He had spent his entire life negotiating, making deals, building a world where words always worked in his favor. But now, standing here, face to face with this boy, he found himself speechless. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then in the most innocent, pure voice, Noah spoke. "Are you the man from the big house?" Richard froze. Lisa turned sharply, her eyes widening as she saw him. She recognized him instantly, the man who had ordered them away, the man who had watched from behind his warm windows while they stood in the rain. Richard didn't know what to say. He had spent his entire life negotiating, making deals, building a world where words always worked in his favor. But now, standing here, face to face with this boy, he found himself speechless. Noah tilted his head, his small hands clutching his mother's sleeve. "Why did you tell us to go away?" he asked, his voice carrying the pure curiosity of a child who didn't yet understand cruelty. Lisa quickly pulled Noah close, as if shielding him from the man before them. She didn't expect Richard to say anything. But he did. "Hi." Richard hesitated, feeling something unfamiliar. A weight on his chest, heavier than anything money or power had ever placed there before. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because for the first time in years, he didn't have an answer. The air between them felt thick, charged with something unspoken. Lisa didn't wait. She turned, picking up Sarah, gripping Noah's hand, and walking away. And Richard, the man who had built his life on control, success, and indifference, found himself standing there, watching them disappear into the crowd. But for the first time, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Regret. And that regret would change everything. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He lay in his massive bed, staring at the ceiling, but all he could see was the boy's face, Noah's wide, innocent eyes asking, "Why did you tell us to go away?" It should have been easy to forget. He had sent plenty of people away before. He had built walls around himself, both real and emotional, to keep the world out. But this time, it was different. Maybe because, deep down, he knew he had crossed a line. He wasn't just a man protecting his property from strangers. He had turned away a mother and her children in the middle of a storm. As the night dragged on, he finally got up and walked to his office. He sat at his desk, fingers hovering over his phone, hesitating. Then, without fully understanding why, he made a call. "Find out where they are," he said to his assistant, "the woman and her children." There was a pause on the other end. His assistant had worked for him long enough to know Richard never involved himself in personal matters, let alone someone else's. But she didn't question him. By morning, Richard had an answer. Lisa and her children were staying in a temporary shelter, one of the few places in the city that still had space for struggling families. It wasn't much: crowded rooms, thin blankets, meals that barely filled a plate. But it was something. Still, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. For the first time in years, he drove himself instead of using his driver. When he arrived at the shelter, he hesitated before stepping inside. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he wasn't prepared for what he saw. Mothers rocking their babies in their arms. Elderly men sitting in the corners, staring out the windows with empty eyes. Children running barefoot across the cold floors, their laughter thin but still fighting to exist. And then, in the farthest corner, Lisa sat with Sarah and Noah, trying to comb through her daughter's tangled hair with gentle fingers. She looked up, and their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lisa's expression hardened. She stood, pulling her children close. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. Richard felt something heavy in his throat, something unfamiliar. He hesitated, then sighed. "I wanted to talk." Lisa let out a small, tired laugh. "Now, after everything." Richard nodded. He didn't know how to explain it, but he felt like he had to be here. He had spent his life making choices based on logic, on numbers, on what would benefit him. But this was different. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This is for you." Lisa stared at it, but didn't take it. "What is this?" "A new place. An apartment. It's yours. No strings attached," Richard said. Lisa's brows furrowed in disbelief. "Why?" Richard exhaled slowly. "Because I was wrong." Lisa's grip on her children tightened. She wasn't used to kindness, especially not from men like him. "I don't need your pity," she said. "It's not pity," Richard said. "It's a second chance." Lisa hesitated, staring at the envelope as if it might disappear. Then slowly she reached for it. She opened it, and her breath caught when she saw the address. It wasn't just some cheap, forgotten apartment. It was in a safe neighborhood, a place where she and her kids could finally have stability. Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. Richard ran a hand through his hair, looking away. "You don't have to say anything." For the first time in a long time, he felt lighter. He had spent his entire life believing that success meant never looking back, never caring about anything beyond wealth. But now, as he watched Lisa clutch the envelope with shaking hands, he realized something. Money meant nothing if you couldn't use it to do something good. Lisa turned to her children, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. Sarah and Noah looked up at her with hopeful eyes. "Does this mean we have a home?" Noah asked, his voice small. Lisa nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, sweetheart, we have a home." Richard watched as Noah's face broke into a smile. The same boy who had stood in the rain outside his mansion, now looking at him with something almost like gratitude. And for the first time in years, Richard Donovan smiled back. It wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about power. It was about something far more important. It was about doing the right thing.